Hi, my name is Vianey Rienhardt. I'm a licensed professional counselor and the community liaison for Connections Wellness Group located in Denton. Today we're going to be talking about anxiety and depression in children and teens, when to worry and when to relax. We know that symptoms of anxiety and depression can affect each of us throughout our lifetimes. For most of us, the symptoms are manageable and cause only minimal disruptions to our daily functioning. But for some of us, the symptoms of anxiety and depression can be very unmanageable, sometimes life-changing. What we know for children and teens, currently statistics indicate that about 25% of all teens, that's about 1 in 4, struggle with symptoms of anxiety. About 7% of kids between the ages of 3 and 17 have an actual diagnosable anxiety disorder. If we look at that in big numbers, that equates to about 4.4 million kids. What we do know about anxiety is that it's a pretty normal part of childhood. We know that kids go through different phases of anxiety throughout their lifetime. Just think back to when your kids were little toddlers. Oftentimes, they didn't really want to say hello to a new person. Maybe they might have hid behind your leg or clung onto you a little bit more tightly. That's separation anxiety, and it's fairly typical for children, but it's also typical that they would grow out of that. We wouldn't anticipate that a 13-year-old would be hiding behind you or perhaps holding onto you a little tighter when you're introducing them to new people. So we anticipate that for most, symptoms or periods of anxiety are fairly brief and they grow through them to develop more appropriate social skills. So let's talk a little bit about what might be typical for children and adolescents in terms of anxiety. Typical anxiety might present itself as apprehension about the first day of school. A lot of times we had trouble sleeping before we were ready to go to school the next day because of our excitement. That's pretty normal. What we don't expect to see, however, is a refusal to attend school due to fears of being overwhelmed, perhaps feeling as though they're not going to be able to keep up with everyone else. Maybe it's the social environment that's overwhelming, and ultimately that leads kids to say, no, I can't do school today. We expect kids to check over schoolwork and verify their answers. That's a good thing. But we don't want kids to be constantly checking and rechecking and writing and erasing because they want to make sure that their work is perfect. We find it pretty typical for kids to complain sometimes of maybe having a headache or a stomach ache. I know I did that from time to time. But what we don't want to see in kids is constant or more chronic complaints of headaches, stomach pain, even fatigue with no real physical cause. Okay, so another symptom or a typical symptom of anxiety might be expressed in maybe a temporary response to a potentially stressful situation. Perhaps there's an upcoming test, or maybe they're going to go and present in front of the classroom or something like that that might actually make them feel a little bit more stressed out than usual. We expect that to happen with kids from time to time. What we don't expect to see, however, is maybe frequent or very intense feelings of anxiety that actually disrupts their daily functioning. A lot of times kids will complain of feeling like their heart is pounding through their chest, their brain is swimming with too many ideas at once, they might get clammy or build up a sweat. Those are not typical for kids. Kids having worries or fears about something that comes and then passes, that's pretty typical. What isn't typical, however, is spending more time than not being worried or anxious about things that may have happened in the past, or worrying and fearful about things that could be happening in the future. Again, pretty typical to have a fear about going to a party or taking a test. What we don't want to see in kids, though, is consistent resistance to completing tasks or trying something new simply because it's too overwhelming for them. In this graphic, you'll see that anxiety can present itself in a bunch of different ways. So we'll just kind of take it from the top. A lot of times kids who struggle with anxiety may have a strong desire to control people and events in their lives. They believe if they know exactly what's going to happen, then they don't have to worry quite as much. Sometimes that might look like, do we know what time we're going to get there? Do we know what time we're going to leave? Do we know what time we're going to get home? Those types of questions that come consistently might be an indicator of anxiety. Kids might complain that they are having a hard time falling asleep or going to sleep. Many times kids will complain that their brains won't turn off and the worries or the anxieties that they're experiencing throughout the days kind of stick with them, preventing them from being able to sleep. Some kids might present as being really agitated or angry, maybe irritable or hostile. Small things or small frustrations might sometimes turn into really big frustrations. For other kids, they might present with defiance or challenges to authority. Oftentimes, it's when they're asked to do something that they're not quite ready to do. Change can be difficult for kids with anxiety, simply because the fear of the unknown is too much for them and it can become overwhelming. A lot of kids with anxiety will have very high expectations for themselves, which includes their academics, their athletics, their arts, whatever it is. Oftentimes, they get excessively nervous or worried about not performing at the highest levels. Many times kids will avoid activities or events, including school. Kids that are refusing school on a consistent basis, it's usually a pretty good indicator that they might be struggling with some anxiety. Chronic complaints of stomach aches, headaches, or fatigue is a pretty good indicator that it could potentially be anxiety. We always recommend that you take your child to the doctor to rule out any medical conditions. But if all tests come back fairly clear, it probably could be due to feelings of anxiety that are now showing up in their physical presentation versus just their emotional presentation. Kids with anxiety have difficulty paying attention and focusing because their brains tend to be cluttered with a lot of thoughts at one time. They don't like change. There's that intolerance of uncertainty. Many times kids feel like, I know what's going on and what I'm doing right now. If you introduce anything new, I don't think I'm going to be able to handle it. Crying and difficulty managing emotions, that's pretty typical for young children, but it's also difficult for teens. Many times they may tell you, I don't even know why I'm crying. I'm just feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes that's driven by anxiety. Many times kids will overplan for situations and events. They'll talk about it often, going over plans, looking at things that they're going to wear or things that they're going to say, really kind of checking in with multiple people for feedback or advice or opinions simply because they don't even trust themselves. Other symptoms can look like just typical worry about situations or events, but this is about big things and small things and across the board. Maybe the joke is, if you didn't have anything to worry about, you might be worried about that. If that applies, that could be a child who's driven by anxiety. Let's talk a bit about depression in childhood and adolescence. We know that for adolescents at least, they're going to be moody, irritable, apathetic, typical teen kind of stuff. But how do we know what is normal teenagerdom versus something more serious like a depression? How do we know when our little ones are struggling? If that's typical because maybe they just need a nap or maybe they're hungry versus something that could be more significant. Current statistics are indicating that about 1 in 5 teens are going to struggle with some type of symptom of depression during their teen years. So that's about 20% of teens. For kids between the ages of 12 and 17, 20% of girls in that age range and about 6% of boys have a diagnosable level of depression, meaning their symptoms of depression are enough that they're a disruption to their daily living. So let's talk a little bit about what's typical and not typical. We know that for teens in particular, increased parent-child conflict, fairly normal. We know that our teens often see us as not as bright as their peers, so oftentimes they're going to push back a little as they go and move towards independence. What we don't expect to see is maybe verbal or physical aggression from teen to the parent, or even running away behavior. A lot of times kids that are struggling with depression don't know how to manage those emotions, and sometimes they explode rather than being able to talk about those more consistently, especially if they're the type of child to try to stuff that emotion. Sometimes that builds up so much that they have more of an outburst. We know that typically it can be difficult to transition from elementary school into middle school or middle school into high school. And sometimes kids have a difficult time adjusting. What we don't expect to see, though, is a lot of school refusal, perhaps reports that our child is a victim of bullying, or maybe that they are actually bullying other kids. Maybe they're reporting a lack of connection to the school itself or to peers, feeling like they don't really have anyone that they can connect with. And for some kids, it becomes so significant that they just start skipping class or going to school. Fairly typical for teens would be becoming stressed by everyday decision making. Sometimes figuring out what to wear the next day can be overwhelming. But what we don't expect to see for kids is them becoming paralyzed with indecision. They're not able to make a decision without lots of feedback from other people, or simply just don't make decisions, because if they feel like if they don't say anything, then perhaps it might just go away. There's a fairly typical need for an increased desire for privacy. And we see this kind of more and more across the board from young kids, even through the typical teenage years. That's normal. They're kind of depending, can I go back? That's normal. They're kind of experiencing an effort to be independent. We can see that happening as they grow. But what we don't want to see is a real isolation from family or friends. Kids that are spending significant amounts of time in their bedroom, not really socializing, not really talking, not really engaging with family or reaching out to peers, perhaps that they've typically reached out to in the past. In this graphic, we'll kind of talk a little bit about some depression in kids and teens and what those signs and symptoms might look like. Kids that complain of feelings of frequent sadness, perhaps they're feeling low or down most of the time. That's a pretty good indicator that they might be struggling with depression. Kids that may have abandoned things that they used to enjoy doing. They no longer want to do them anymore. Maybe your child enjoyed playing chess in the chess club, or they were an athlete and played basketball. But you've noticed that they've stopped going to practice, or they're not really getting out and doing the things that they used to do that used to bring them joy. That can be an indicator. Reports of a sense of hopelessness, that things aren't going to get better, that things never seem to work out for them. That can be an indication of depression. Kids that are missing school, either due to school refusal or perhaps because they're feeling too tired and they'd rather sleep all day. That could be an indicator as well. One of the significant indicators for a potential issue is a child who's been doing well in school and then all of a sudden their school performance drops off. So perhaps you had a child who's making A's and B's or B's and C's consistently, and now they're bringing home more D's. Or maybe they're failing and bringing home F's, and that's very atypical for them. You may want to check in with them to see if they might be struggling. A lot of times kids will complain about poor concentration or an inability to really focus on what's in front of them, maybe having to read a paragraph over and over again before they understand it. Oftentimes it's because their brain is, again, cluttered and distracted with other things. Relationship issues, that can mean it's between your child and a peer, or between yourself and your child. A lot of times kids who are struggling with depression feel really low and kind of draggy most of the time, and really don't want to put a whole lot of effort into engaging with other people. Talks of or attempts to run away, again, for a lot of kids, that's a way to cope. I just want to get away from it all. If I wasn't around, maybe things would be easier for me. So they fantasize about just kind of taking off, perhaps with the idea of the grass being greener elsewhere. Kids that complain of low energy or a loss of energy, if it's not something that can be medically or connected to something medically, it could potentially be that they are struggling with symptoms of depression. Thoughts of self-harm or efforts to self-harm that could include things like cutting or burning themselves, drinking alcohol or using drugs. Those are often indicators of a child who's trying to cope with symptoms of depression. If they're isolating or withdrawing more significantly than you've ever seen them before, then you may want to check in with them. Oftentimes kids really just want to block out the world when they're feeling low. That means they don't have to put much effort in, especially when they're feeling like they don't have any energy at all. Frequent complaints of illness. This kind of mirrors anxiety a bit, but a lot of times kids will say that they have headaches or they have stomach pains. Sometimes our bodies tend to take the brunt of what's going on with us emotionally. There's anger and irritability again, much again like anxiety. Oftentimes kids who are feeling pretty low and feeling pretty crummy in terms of how they're doing emotionally really have very little frustration tolerance for others, and oftentimes feel overwhelmed when people are asking them too many questions. And then you might look for changes in eating or sleeping patterns. A lot of times kids will sleep quite a bit. Perhaps they're coming home and going right to bed, or they're sleeping for long periods. For some kids though, they don't sleep at all, and they're reporting maybe getting 1 or 2 hours of sleep a night. What we do know about anxiety and depression is that they are often co-occurring conditions. About half of those that are diagnosed with depression are often also diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. A lot of times I'll say anxiety and depression can be best friends. There's good news and bad news, though, that comes with anxiety and depression. The good news is that they are very treatable with excellent recovery rates. The bad news, though, is that about an estimated 80% of kids with diagnosable anxiety disorders and 60% of kids with diagnosable depression are not getting the treatment that they need. Sometimes it's because we feel like maybe they're just going through a phase. If the phase is lasting a little longer than you might expect, it may be time to check things out. So now that we know what signs of anxiety and depression might look like in our child, what are some things we can do? First things first, pay attention to your child's feelings. Really take some time to talk with them one-on-one and just listen. Try not to lecture, try not to fix things for them. Just try to hear where they're coming from so you can get a good understanding of how they're experiencing it. For kids that may not be really willing to talk with you, be persistent. Sometimes they're just not sure that they wouldn't burden you with what's going on with them. Let them know that you're concerned about them and you're willing to listen, and together you guys can work to help them get to a place where they're feeling good again. Stay engaged with your child. Encourage your child to maintain social connections with their family, with their friends, perhaps through volunteering or activities. Oftentimes we find that kids who are struggling with anxiety and depression want to withdraw. It's actually that withdrawal that makes those symptoms more profound. So trying to keep them engaged with family, whether it's everybody having dinner together, everyone watching a show together, that they're around other people, makes them feel less alone and isolated, and actually can improve mood. As does encouraging healthy activities. Limiting screen time is a huge indicator for kids of higher levels of anxiety and depression. Some research has even indicated that kids who spend more than 6 hours on any kind of screen a day have significantly higher reports of symptoms of anxiety and depression, whereas kids who spend less than 2 hours of time in front of a screen have almost no reports of symptoms of anxiety and depression. So cutting down some of that screen time can be really beneficial for them. Exercise produces great endorphins. That's good stuff for the brain, makes us feel good. Encourage your child to walk the dog, maybe go out and ride their bike or shoot baskets, and provide healthy meals for your child. Limiting sugar, caffeine intake, it can be really beneficial for kids. And then of course, encourage them to get adequate rest and sleep. So when you feel like anxiety and depression symptoms might be more significant for your child, a great next step would be meeting with a mental health professional. And there's all different kinds of providers available. You might find someone who is a licensed professional counselor, or an LPC, someone who is a licensed clinical social worker, an LCSW, a psychologist, and even a psychiatrist. All of these have specific training in working with children and adolescents who are struggling with emotional or behavioral issues. Talk therapy is always an excellent first start for anyone who's struggling with anxiety and depression. So that might be in the form of individual therapy, going to group therapy with peers, and even family therapy. Oftentimes, symptoms of anxiety and depression can be best treated when talk therapy is used in combination with medication prescribed by a psychiatrist. Your individual therapist would be a great person to speak with about potentially including psychiatry as part of your treatment journey. I appreciate the time that you've spent to review this information and find out a little bit more about symptoms of anxiety and depression. I hope you found the information helpful. And if at any time you need additional services, feel free to find us at Connections Wellness Group, located in Denton, Texas.